What was Joffrey Baratheon's tax policy? What about Robert Baratheon or the Targaryens? Were they progressive rulers, or did they just try to get every penny they could from the small folk? Where did their money come from? Hi everyone, this is Robert. Welcome to Deep Geek. On this channel we cover A Song of Ice and Fire, The Lord of the Rings, The Witcher, and much more. If you're interested in that, welcome. George R. R. Martin once famously asked what Aragorn's tax policy was when he was king. It was part of a wider point about government systems and morality in fantasy world building, but it does beg the question, what about the rulers in George R. R. Martin's own world? If we shouldn't just accept that Aragorn was a good king and ruler because he was a good man, then we also shouldn't just accept that Joffrey was a bad king and ruler because he was a bad person. What was Joffrey's tax policy? Do we even know? Well, we do actually know quite a lot about tax in Westeros. It's mentioned not just as a bit of background information, but often as a central plot point. I'll get onto that in just a minute, but let's just first set out the landscape of tax in Westeros, because although different monarchs did make changes to tax rates and who had to pay which taxes, the methodologies of tax collection seem to have stayed roughly the same throughout the period after Aegon's invasion. And we're told in Fire and Blood that King Aegon also issued decrees regularising customs, duties and taxes throughout the realm, whereas previously every port and every petty lord had been free to exact however much they could from tenants, small folk and merchants. He also proclaimed that the holy men and women of the faith and all their lands and possessions were to be exempt from taxation. So a pretty big tax exemption there for the Faith of the Seven, and an attempt at regularising taxes throughout the land. What does that look like in practice? Well, there already seems to have been a long-established system of paying your due to your lord, much like in standard feudal systems. In effect, this is a sort of tax on production. Jaime once notes in passing that mills are a valuable source of tax for local lords, as they receive 1/10 of all the grain they grind. The principle remains the same regardless of whether this is the lord charging the local small folk for use of their mill, or just requiring a cut of what is produced. And it's not just mills. This principle seems to apply across the Seven Kingdoms. It's just that the exact production mechanisms to be taxed varies by geography. Wine presses in the south, or seal skins in the north, for example. If you catch 10 seals, skin them and sell the skins, then 1/10, or whatever the local rate is due to the overlord. A lot of this local tax, or tithe, seems to be paid in kind rather than cash, like the grain from mills we noted a moment ago, which allows the lords to have grain and therefore eat without themselves going out into the fields with a plough or scythe. An income which is supplemented by whatever the overlord family also produces themselves from their own holdings. The Lannisters claim their due from their vassals, for example, but also have their own income from their mines. Of course, in an age where the feudal lord might only be able to visit all of their far-flung lands once a year or even less frequently, the potential for cheating on your taxes, as it were, is significant. No doubt some medieval equivalents of tax collectors were employed, but still, tax evasion was a thing. Though it has to be said that the system does have some benefits for the taxpayers as well as the tax-receiving nobles. House Stark, for example, certainly seems to stockpile a lot of the grain it accrues through this system to help feed those gathered sheltering in Wintertown outside Winterfell during the long winter months or years. Those unable to pay their due in cash or goods can give their time instead. Maintenance on a lord's castle walls, for example, or helping bring in crops. Such work can obviously pay dividends if you are then allowed to shelter behind those walls or eat that food in times of danger. As complex and nuanced as local taxation systems may be, the overall picture is that a proportion of income always works its way up the social pyramid. Farmers pay to their local lord. They pay to their lord, who pays it to the lord paramount of the region, who pays to the crown of the Seven Kingdoms. So we have a patchwork of local taxes, regularised to some extent by Aegon the Conqueror, in a vaguely feudal system that work their way up from local lords to lords paramount, and ultimately the Iron Throne itself. Exceptions and petty disputes abound, however, even higher up in the food chain. Dawn negotiated being able to keep many of its own laws on acceding to the Seven Kingdoms. Those living in the Gift and the New Gift owe their tithe, as it were, to the Night's Watch rather than a local lord, much to the local lord's annoyance. Some houses in Cracklaw Point claim that as they surrendered to Visenya personally back in Aegon's invasion, they owe taxes only direct to the Targaryens, not their local lords. House Celtigar sees things differently for understandable reasons, and so on. But as widespread as this system is, and as much as it presumably ultimately benefits the Crown, it seems that the Crown gains most of its revenue from other taxes, based less on production and more on trade and the movement of goods and people. The most notable of which seems to be customs duties or port taxes. This gets mentioned again and again in A Song of Ice and Fire and to the wider histories George R. R. Martin has given us. Let's take a few examples to show how this works. Aerys II, the Mad King, doubled and trebled port fees across the entire Seven Kingdoms when he ruled, causing a huge uproar before backing down and blaming Tywin Lannister, his Hand of the King. Later, the defiance of Duskendale, when Aerys was kidnapped and imprisoned, was sparked by Lord Darklyn wanting the ability to lower port taxes in his port, but not being able to because that's the King's prerogative. And in the main story of A Song of Ice and Fire, we hear about a dispute in White Harbour after Robb Stark had been declared king in the north. Some customs officials had carried on passing the money they took to King's Landing, rather than the new king in the north. Lord Manderley sought permission from his new king to have them replaced. So port fees, basically import tariffs at the main ports, are due to the Iron Throne. And that's not the end of the taxes. We read that Littlefinger, as Master of Coin, created a tax on certain fine wines. That money went straight to the Crown. So the Crown reserves the right to tax pretty much whatever it wants. Other inventive taxes at various times in Westerosi history include the tax on crenellations, effectively on new-build castles, spices, and luxury goods. And finally, we have King's Landing itself. The ruler of the Seven Kingdoms also has direct control over taxes within the city, and more broadly, as Lord Paramount of the Crown Lands. And it's these taxes in King's Landing that often have the greatest impact on the story. Several pages of Fire and Blood are devoted to the various considered tax changes made in the reign of Jaehaerys I, and then again towards the end of the Dance of the Dragons with the slightly less considered and considerably more resented taxes then. On the whole, it's worth noting that there is generally a good amount of thinking going into the taxes on King's Landing. They are targeted, not just attempts to raise cash. Rhaego Draz, the so-called Lord of Air, who was Jaehaerys' Master of Coin, introduced a tax on luxury goods because it targeted the rich only, rather than the small folk, and the rich would pay. And the tax on crenellations we noted earlier, also under Jaehaerys, discouraged nobles from building strongholds from which they could oppose the king. Clever. Not all were so enlightened, though. Lord Celtigar, Rhaego Draz's predecessor, introduced a whole raft of taxes that impacted most on the poorest, including flat fees to enter or leave the city. Most tellingly of all, though, are the tax changes that took place when Rhaenyra sat on the Iron Throne during the Dance of the Dragons. Her Master of Coin, another Lord Celtigar, we read, restored the self-same taxes that his ancestor Lord Edwell had once enacted, and piled on many a new levy besides. Taxes on wine and ale were doubled, port fees tripled, every shopkeeper within the city walls was assessed a fee for the right to keep his doors open. Innkeeps were required to pay 1 silver stag for each bed in their inns. The entry and exit fees that the Lord of Air had once assessed were brought back and tripled. A tax on property was decreed. Rich merchants in their manses or beggars in hovels all must pay, depending on how much land they took up. The result was perhaps inevitable. Thus did Queen Rhaenyra replenish her coffers at grievous cost. Many Kingslanders had welcomed the Queen's return, but love and hate are two faces of the same coin. As fresh heads began appearing daily upon the spikes above the city gates, accompanied by ever more exacting taxes, the coin turned. The girl they had once cheered as the realm's delight had grown into a grasping and vindictive woman, men said, a queen as cruel as any king before her. The people turned on Rhaenyra. There were riots, the dragon pit was stormed, and she was forced to flee the city, all or mostly because of tax rises. However else you might want to interpret the events of the Dance of the Dragons through Fire and Blood, it's clear that Rhaenyra's taxes were a hugely significant factor in turning people against her, inspiring civil unrest and ending the rule of the dragons in Westeros. The line of causality between the taxes and the storming of the Dragon Pit is a strong one. I do wonder whether this might also find an echo in the story in The Winds of Winter. We already saw discontent during Joffrey's reign when Tywin instituted a tax on brothels. Tyrion got the blame for that, even though he had nothing to do with it. The dwarf's penny, people called it. But the crown's debts are much, much worse than at the end of A Dance with Dragons. In the epilogue, Kevan Lannister thinks that unless a new source of coin could be found, or the Iron Bank persuaded to relent, he would have no choice but to pay the crown's debts with Lannister gold. He dare not resort to new taxes, not with the Seven Kingdoms crawling with rebellion. Half the lords in the realm could not tell taxation from tyranny, and would bolt to the nearest usurper in a heartbeat if it would save them a clipped copper. But Kevan, with his sensible approach to taxation, will not be there in The Winds of Winter. Cersei will. Will we see an echo of Rhaenyra in Cersei's actions? I think so. She will want to raise money. She won't care what the people think. Indeed, she may even want some sort of petty revenge on them for seeing her naked in the Walk of Atonement, and she isn't exactly strategic in her thinking. Yes, I could see her raising taxes punitively, making the people hate her just as Aegon VI, approaches the city, offering an alternative ruler. There's no prizes for guessing who the people would choose. At which point, we should probably mention Littlefinger once again. In many ways, he was responsible for the Crown's debt crisis in A Dance with Dragons, if only by allowing the Crown's debt to spiral so much. We're lucky to have Tyrion follow him in overseeing the Crown's books, because we see through Tyrion's eyes what Littlefinger did. Littlefinger's rise had been arrow-swift. Within 3 years of his coming to court, he was Master of Coin and member of the Small Council. And today, the Crown's revenues were 10 times what they had been under his beleaguered predecessor, though the Crown's debts had grown vast as well. A master juggler was Peter Baelish. Oh, he was clever. He did not simply collect the gold and lock it in a treasure vault, no. He paid the king's debts in promises and took the king's gold to work. He bought wagons, shops, ships, houses. He bought grain when it was plentiful and sold bread when it was scarce. He bought wool from the north and linen from the south and lace from Lys, stored it, moved it, dyed it, sold it. The golden dragons bred and multiplied, and Littlefinger lent them out and brought them home with hatchlings. Basically, Littlefinger turned the Iron Throne into a trading and speculative enterprise. This provided an income 10 times what it was, apparently, but also he loaded on debt. And if his successors couldn't keep up with those debt repayments, because, say, they had to defend the capital from an impending attack by Stannis, there would be trouble from the Iron Bank. Put simply, taxes are important in George R. R. Martin's world, and tax policy changes have real-world impacts. Increasing customs duties reduces trade. Increasing taxes on the poor make the poor hate you, and so on. Punitive tax measures during the Dance of the Dragons and loading on state debt before the War of the Five Kings had literal regime-changing implications. So, all that said, what was Joffrey's tax policy? Well, the short answer is that he didn't really have one. Tywin was his Hand of the King, and Tywin took very much a hands-on approach to ruling in Joffrey's stead. Tyrion was technically only ever acting Hand of the King while his father was absent, and in Joffrey's short rule, he was only king for just over a year, we don't read of any massive wholesale tax changes. That's probably understandable, given that the realm was at war pretty much all of that time. Trying to get money from the north or the Iron Islands, say, would be hard work, and a change in tax rate wouldn't make much difference. Which is to say that Joffrey's tax base shrank massively during his tenure. The north, the Riverlands and the Iron Islands declared independence, so stopped paying their dues. The Stormlands and the Reach briefly did the same, which of course would have led to less money for the crown, and increased pressure to increase income from elsewhere, particularly when Littlefinger's ability to maximise the value of the crown's assets was removed. Still, we really just see a few small tweaks here and there under Joffrey, like a tax rebate for House Redwine, and that morality tax on brothels. In truth, Joffrey Baratheon's personal tax policy was very much like Robert Baratheon's, which is to say, he didn't really have anything to do with it at all, but he inherited a patchwork of feudal obligations, port fees and customs duties, and lots of small taxes in King's Landing itself, and left it to other people to figure out what to do with all that. The resultant tax regime wasn't particularly punitive by historical standards in the Seven Kingdoms, but nor was it particularly progressive, or, it has to be said, effective. War cut off revenue from some parts of the Seven Kingdoms, trade plummeted, and Littlefinger ensured that his own network of tax collectors got their own cut. In Joffrey's time, the Crown's finances were in a parlous state, and tax revenues were down hugely. However, neither he nor Tywin lived long enough to have to make the tough decisions that were needed. Those will have to wait until the Winds of Winter. But, amateur economists, I'm intrigued. What would you have done in Joffrey's place? You have debtors calling, your tax base is drastically reduced, and the local population is already angry with you. More invaders are on their way. Is there a tax policy that actually works here? Let me know in the comments below. If you're interested in more videos about the world of Ice and Fire, please click on the link to the playlist on the left of your screen. Or if you'd like to support this channel, thank you. There's a link to my Patreon page on the right of your screen. That's all for this time. Thanks for watching. I'll see you again soon.